Okay, so building thinking classrooms. I'm going to take you through a bit of a journey, tell a bit of a story of where this came from, what motivated it, what some of the results are, and what some of the implications are. So for me, this story began almost 20 years ago. I'm a former high school math teacher. I spent time as a teacher. But in 2003, I was out of the classroom. I was working on my PhD, doing a doctorate in math education. And I kind of built an opportunity for myself to visit classrooms. And I called it an opportunity because as a teacher, you're so consumed with the act of teaching that it's really hard to pay attention to students. And when we do pay attention to students, we only see the part that students want us to see. And I really wanted to understand what students' lived experience is, what the students are experiencing in a mathematics classroom. So I reached out to a network of friends and I asked them to recommend to me good teachers that they had heard were good. And then I contacted those teachers and I introduced myself and I said, I'd like to come and spend some time in your classroom. So-and-so says you're a good teacher. And when you send an email like that, they usually say yes. And they did. And then when I was in those classrooms, I would ask them to make recommendations and so on and so forth. And because I was following this thread of good teacher, I got to see a lot of diversity. I was in kindergarten classrooms all the way up to grade 12. I was in low socioeconomic settings, high socioeconomic settings, private schools, public schools, inner city schools, urban schools, rural schools. I saw a lot of diversity. And I was able to visit 40 different classrooms in 40 different schools. And despite all this diversity, everywhere I went, I saw the same thing. Every single lesson I went into, I saw students not thinking. Now, at first, I didn't really notice this. I was paying attention to too many other things. And then I started to get this sense that what I'm seeing is that students are not thinking. And at first, it was just a sense. But I turned that into a research question. I spent a lot of time in classrooms trying to answer the question, are students thinking? And if they're not, what is it that they're doing? And this research produced what I come to call my baseline data. And it revealed that in a typical lesson, some students are thinking. About 20% of students are thinking. But they're only thinking for about 20% of the time, which means that if I'm observing a 1 hour lesson, 5 or 6 students will think for 8 to 12 minutes. The rest of the students are doing no thinking. At least not the kind of thinking we know students need to do in order to continue to be successful in mathematics. What are they doing instead? They're mimicking. So what is mimicking? Mimicking is where the teacher shows them how to do it and the students just copy it. And this is a problem. And why is it a problem? Because mimicking is so effective in the short term. If a student mimics, they will be successful now. They might even be successful tonight. They might be successful on the quiz tomorrow. But mimicking actually runs out at some point. Mimicking as a learning strategy stops being effective eventually as the students get older. And the things that they learn through mimicking fades very quickly because they haven't actually learned it. And the reason for this is that they're not thinking. Thinking is a necessary precursor to learning. If students are not thinking, they're not learning. And mimicking is not thinking. Mimicking is not learning. This is a problem. The other thing I noticed when I visited these classrooms, and this is going to seem incongruous with what I just said, is that I saw very good teachers. I asked to be referred to good teachers. I saw good teachers. These were hardworking, dedicated professionals. They knew their content. They knew their kids. They cared that the kids learned the content. Nobody was falling through the cracks. But when I interviewed these teachers, they all said the same thing. This is not why I became a teacher. I became a teacher because I want students to understand. I want them to have passion. I want them to see connections. And what I feel like I'm doing instead is it feels like I'm just show and tell. I feel like I'm cutting content into small bite-sized pieces and feeding it to the students. This is not why I became a teacher. The other thing I noticed as I visited these classrooms was that classrooms look more alike than they look different. Sure, there's differences, but there are so many similarities. I've been in classrooms on 6 different continents, and it doesn't matter if I'm in Sweden or Chile or Australia or Taiwan. Everywhere I go, classrooms look alike. And in the 40 classrooms I visited, it happened multiple times that I would walk into a room and I would say, hold on, I've been in this room. I want to be in different classrooms. I'd look through my digital photos. Yeah, there it is. Look at my logbook. No, different school, different town. Like classrooms look so much alike. And what happens in classrooms looks so much alike, right? There was this set of practices I kept seeing over and over and over again. There was the lecture, the Q&A, question and answer, maybe some demonstration by a student. But every single lesson I observed ended with students doing individual seat work. Every one of those 40 lessons ended exactly the same. And what this means is that, or what's interesting about this is that the fact that classrooms look alike and what happens in classrooms looks alike has been true for a very long time. Public education has existed for about 150 years, since the end of the first industrial revolution. And when it was formed, it laid down a set of practices that are still with us today. I do. We do. You do. This is what teaching has always looked like. This is what it looks like. No wonder students are mimicking, because everything we do as teachers is laid out to create an I do, we do, you do situation. What has changed in education in the last 150 years? So yeah, I visited these 40 classrooms 20 years ago, but 20 days ago, I was in a school and I walked down the hallway and 18 out of the 20 classrooms I looked in on were all teaching exactly the same way. I do, we do, you do. The students were sitting there mimicking, not thinking. They were disengaged, they were bored. Right? So what this means is that these are not classrooms norms. These are not norms that the teacher has constructed. These are institutional norms. These are normative structures that have permeated the very fabric of school in such a way that we see it everywhere, all over the world. And in many ways, these are non-negotiable, meaning that teachers don't think they have any choice. This is what teaching looks like. This is what teaching has always looked like. This is what teaching always will look like. And I started to realize that if everywhere I go, I see students not thinking, and everywhere I go, I see these institutional norms, these things must be connected. And what that means is, if I want to get students to think, I'm going to have to start breaking these institutional norms. And that became my research project. And for over 15 years, I worked with over 400 teachers, conducting thousands and thousands of micro experiments. We were trying to renegotiate the non-negotiated norms. Our goal was to break the norms and see if it could have an impact on thinking. We only cared about two possible results. Could we get more students thinking? Could we get them thinking for longer? That's all we were trying to do. And we had immediate success. The minute we started breaking these norms, we started to see student thinking. And the more we broke them, the more thinking we saw. Eventually, I reorganized the research into 14 variables. Each of these variables was a response to one of these questions. These are the core classroom practices that every teacher does. Okay, maybe if you're teaching 5-year-olds or 6-year-olds, maybe you're not having them write notes or do homework. But at a certain point, every teacher is using these practices. We all use tasks. We all use collaborative groups. We all answer questions and give homework and have students write notes. We all do assessment, evaluation, report cards. We do these things. And for the most part, they're done with close adherence to these normative practices that I was seeing in the classrooms. And what I was looking for was, is there a way to do each of these practices in such a way that it gets students to think? And not just that it gets them to think, I was looking for the optimal practices for thinking, meaning that I was looking for a practice that any teacher can pick up and have a maximum effect on student thinking. That's what we were looking for. And to be clear, I'm not looking for a practice that a particular teacher can make work. Too much of research and education focuses on a particular teacher. But the problem with that is that so much of a teacher's effectiveness is wrapped up in their personality and their charm and their charisma. I wanted a practice that was devoid of that practice that would work no matter who picked it up. And then that practice would be made more powerful by them adding their personality into it. And before I talk about what these optimal practices are, I just want to say that at no point were the normative practices number one. It would have made my job easier. It would have made it easier if I could point at something that happens in school and say, that's good. Let's just keep doing that. But every time we tested that theory, it showed that the normative practices were ineffective for thinking. And in fact, out of the thousands of experiments we conducted, not only did they never win, not only did the normative practices never come out on top, in almost every instance, they came out last. For some of these variables, we would try 20 things, and the normative practice would be dead last. And to understand why that is, we have to go back to the dawn of public education. When public education was formed, the goals of education were conformity and compliance. That was the purpose of education. And it was inside of the crucible of conformity and compliance that practices like I do, we do, you do were forged. Our goals for education are different now. We talk about 21st century learning skills. We talk about critical and creative thinking. We talk about equity. We talk about entrepreneurship and financial literacy. We have different goals for education now. And there's no way we can achieve today's goal for education using 19th century practices that were born out of a desire to create conformity and compliance. We need new goals. We'll never achieve today's goals using yesterday's practices. And this is why the normative practices never came out on top. So what were these optimal practices? Well, there they are. And today I'm only going to talk about the first three, which is a really good starting point for a teacher to start thinking about building a thinking classroom.